42 times. 42 documented moments when the course of the Second World War, and perhaps all of modern history, could have changed entirely. Some were elaborate, some were accidental, some came within inches, and every single one failed. This is the story of how one man survived what history kept throwing at him. Before getting into the attempts themselves, it is worth understanding why so many people, soldiers, generals, civilians, foreign intelligence services, and members of Hitler's own inner circle, spent years trying to end his life. By the mid-1930s, Adolf Hitler had consolidated total control over Germany. The democratic institutions of the Weimar Republic had been dismantled piece by piece. Political opposition had been crushed, imprisoned, or driven into exile. The apparatus of the Nazi state, the SS, the Gestapo, the concentration camp system, was already in operation. And Hitler's foreign policy ambitions, which he had never concealed, were pointing directly toward war. Those who saw what was coming, and there were many, both inside Germany and beyond its borders, understood that removing Hitler was not simply a political act. It was, to their minds, a matter of preventing catastrophe on a scale the world had never seen. What followed was one of the most extraordinary series of failed attempts in recorded history. Some were carried out by trained professionals with access to weapons and intelligence networks. Others were improvised, desperate, and nearly suicidal in their conception. A few came so close that the outcome seemed to hinge on nothing more than a last-minute change of plans or a coat left behind in a room. And yet, through a combination of obsessive security, unpredictable behavior, and what some of his followers chose to call fate, Hitler survived all of them. Part of what made the attempts so difficult was the security apparatus Hitler had constructed around himself. As early as the mid-1930s, his movements were among the most tightly controlled of any head of state in the world. Routes were changed without notice. Schedules were altered at the last minute. Multiple decoy vehicles traveled alongside his motorcade. Tasters sampled his food before it reached the table. Every visitor to his presence was searched, every package screened. This security was not born purely of paranoia, though paranoia was certainly present. It was the product of a regime that understood from its earliest days that what it was doing generated enemies. The more people Hitler killed or imprisoned, the larger the pool of people with reason to want him dead. The earliest serious attempts on his life came long before the war, back when he was still consolidating power, and when the window to stop what was coming was still just barely open. The first documented threats to Hitler's life came almost as soon as he entered public life. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, as the Nazi Party rose from a fringe movement to a mainstream political force, Hitler was a visible and frequently public figure, giving speeches in beer halls, attending rallies, traveling by open car through German cities. He was not yet the heavily fortified, reclusive figure he would become during the war years. In 1930, a young man attempted to shoot Hitler during a public appearance in Munich. The attempt failed before it could be carried out. The would-be assailant was identified and removed before he could act. The details of this case were largely suppressed by the Nazi authorities, as they were with most early attempts, to avoid projecting any image of vulnerability. A more organized attempt came in 1933, the year Hitler became Chancellor of Germany. A group of opponents within Germany, aware of what his assumption of power meant, made contact with one another with the intention of preventing him from fully consolidating control. The plan never reached the execution stage, largely because the speed with which Hitler moved to eliminate political opposition left his opponents with almost no time to organize. But perhaps the most striking early case was that of Beppo Roemer, a former army officer and decorated veteran of the First World War who had turned against the Nazi movement. In the early 1930s, Roemer was involved in efforts to organize armed resistance against Hitler. He was arrested by the Gestapo in 1934, escaped, continued his activities, was arrested again, and was eventually executed in 1944, but not before his networks had contributed to broader resistance efforts that would last for years. What the early period illustrated was a pattern that would hold throughout Hitler's life. The people most capable of stopping him were also the most exposed to his security apparatus, and the window of opportunity for action kept narrowing as the regime tightened its grip. The most spectacular early attempt, however, came not from within Germany, but from a single man acting almost entirely alone. And it came closer to succeeding than almost anyone realized at the time. On the evening of November 8, 1939, Adolf Hitler stood at a podium in the Bürgerbräukeller, a large beer hall in Munich, delivering his annual speech commemorating the failed 1923 beer hall putsch, the moment the Nazi Party had attempted to seize power by force and been defeated. It was one of the most predictable events in the Nazi calendar. Hitler gave this speech every year, on the same date, in the same building. Georg Elser knew this, and for months he had been planning to use it. Elser was a carpenter and craftsman from Württemberg in southwestern Germany. He had no formal military training, no intelligence connections, and no organization behind him. He was not a politician or an ideologue. He was a working man who had watched the Nazi regime dismantle the rights and living standards of ordinary workers, and who had concluded on his own that Hitler needed to be stopped. Beginning in the autumn of 1938, Elser visited the Bürgerbräukeller repeatedly, studying its layout, learning the schedules of the staff, and identifying the structural column directly behind the podium, where Hitler consistently stood during his speeches. He then began the painstaking work of hollowing out that column, working alone at night, hiding inside the building after closing time, cutting through wood and masonry with hand tools over a period of more than 30 nights, and concealing his work each morning before the building opened. Inside the hollowed column, he constructed and installed a time bomb of considerable sophistication. He built the detonation mechanism himself, using 2 clock movements to ensure reliability. The device was set to detonate at 9:20 p.m. on November 8, 1939, timed precisely to the midpoint of Hitler's speech when he would be at the podium. The bomb detonated exactly as planned, the column exploded, the ceiling above the podium collapsed. 7 people were killed and 63 were injured. The carnage at the spot where Hitler had been standing was severe, but Hitler was not there. On that particular evening, for reasons that had nothing to do with any knowledge of the plot, Hitler had cut his speech short. The thick fog across Germany that night had grounded his aircraft, and he had decided to return to Berlin by train, a journey that required an earlier departure. He had left the building approximately 13 minutes before the bomb went off. 13 minutes. Elser was arrested at the Swiss border later that night, attempting to cross into Switzerland. He was carrying evidence that linked him directly to the bomb, materials, and a postcard of the beer hall. Under Gestapo interrogation, he described the plot in meticulous detail, explaining every step of the construction and placement of the device with a precision that left his interrogators struggling to believe that a single untrained craftsman could have pulled it off. They spent years trying to find his co-conspirators, convinced the operation was too sophisticated for one man. There were none. Elser spent the remainder of the war in concentration camps, held as a special prisoner. On April 9, 1945, less than a month before Germany's surrender, he was executed on direct orders from the SS leadership. The Elser attempt stands apart from all others for the simplicity of its conception and the nearness of its success. Had the fog not descended that evening, had Hitler's schedule remained as planned, one carpenter with hand tools and a homemade timer would have changed the course of the war. What Elser did alone, however, a network of German military officers would spend years trying to replicate, with far greater resources and far less success. Georg Elser acted alone. The resistance that developed inside the German military was something altogether different. A long, fractured, agonizing effort by senior officers and officials who had taken oaths of loyalty to Hitler, and who wrestled, sometimes for years, with whether to break them. The military resistance to Hitler was not a single organized movement. It was a loose constellation of individuals and small groups, connected by shared alarm at the direction of the war, and by a mutual understanding that Hitler's decisions were leading Germany toward total destruction. What held them back, repeatedly, was not lack of motivation, but a combination of moral paralysis, failed timing, and the near impossibility of coordinating action under a surveillance state. One of the earliest military plots came in 1938, in the weeks leading up to Hitler's annexation of the Sudetenland, the German-speaking border region of Czechoslovakia. General Ludwig Beck, then chief of the German General Staff, was so alarmed by Hitler's plans that he resigned his position in protest, an act of extraordinary significance in a military culture where obedience was absolute. Around Beck gathered a group of officers and civilian officials, among them General Franz Halder, who succeeded Beck as chief of staff, and Hans Oster, a senior officer in military intelligence, who developed a plan to arrest Hitler the moment he gave the order to invade Czechoslovakia, on the grounds that such an order would constitute criminal recklessness. The plan was never executed because Hitler did not give that order. Instead, the British and French governments at the Munich Conference in September 1938 agreed to allow Germany to annex the Sudetenland without military conflict. The diplomatic capitulation Hitler had not expected removed the trigger the conspirators had been waiting for. And when he walked away from Munich having achieved his objectives without firing a shot, his prestige within Germany soared, making any attempt to move against him far more difficult. The same pattern repeated itself. Again and again, the conspirators would develop a plan, identify a trigger, and then find that circumstances changed before they could act. Hitler's unpredictable schedule, his habit of changing plans at the last moment, and the sheer logistical difficulty of getting close enough to him with a weapon made every attempt an exercise in frustrated preparation. In March 1943, a group of officers on the Eastern Front made what may have been the most carefully planned attempt of the entire war. Colonel Henning von Treschow, serving on the staff of Army Group Center, arranged for a package to be placed aboard Hitler's personal aircraft, following an inspection visit to the Eastern headquarters at Smolensk. The package was presented as a gift, 2 bottles of Cointreau liqueur being sent to a contact in Berlin. Inside was a bomb, constructed from British-made plastic explosive that had been obtained through the German resistance's contacts with British intelligence. The device was designed to detonate in flight, destroying the aircraft over Germany. The fuse was activated as the plane took off. The bomb did not detonate. The mechanism had failed. The detonator fuse had not ignited, almost certainly because of the extreme cold in the aircraft's unheated cargo hold during the flight from the Eastern Front. When the plane landed safely in Berlin, von Treschow sent a colleague, Fabian von Schlabrendorf, to retrieve the package before it could be examined. Schlabrendorf traveled to Berlin, swapped the package for a real bottle of liqueur, and carried the live bomb back to Army Group Center's headquarters, diffusing it in a hotel room with nothing but a penknife, working slowly and carefully in full knowledge that one mistake would kill him. He survived. The bomb was recovered intact. Hitler never knew it had been aboard his plane. Just days later, another attempt was made. An officer named Rudolf Christoph von Gersdorf volunteered to carry explosives concealed in his coat into a military exhibition in Berlin that Hitler was scheduled to attend, intending to detonate the device while standing beside him. He activated the fuses before entering the hall. Hitler walked through the entire exhibition in approximately 8 minutes, far less than the 10-minute minimum detonation time of the available fuses. Von Gersdorf had to excuse himself and defuse the live device in a bathroom while the exhibition continued around him. He succeeded, barely. The failure of each attempt fed the next, driving the conspirators toward increasingly desperate measures and toward the plan that would come closest of all to succeeding. By the summer of 1944, the military situation for Germany was catastrophic. Allied forces had landed in Normandy on June 6, 1944, opening a second front in Western Europe. On the Eastern Front, Soviet forces had launched Operation Bagration, a massive offensive that was tearing through German Army Group Center with devastating effect. Senior German officers who understood military reality knew that the war was lost. For the conspirators within the German military, this created both urgency and a new justification. Killing Hitler was no longer simply a moral act. It was, they argued, the only way to end the war before Germany was entirely destroyed. The man chosen to carry the bomb was Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, a decorated combat officer who had been severely wounded in North Africa in 1943, losing his right hand, 2 fingers from his left hand, and his left eye. Despite his injuries, Stauffenberg had become one of the central figures of the military resistance, driven by an absolute conviction that Hitler had to be stopped. Stauffenberg had been given access to Hitler's military briefings at the Wolf's Lair the heavily fortified field headquarters in East Prussia, in his capacity as Chief of Staff to the Reserve Army. This access made him the only member of the conspiracy who could reliably get close enough to Hitler to place a bomb. On July 20th, 1944, Stauffenberg arrived at the Wolf's Lair carrying a briefcase containing 2 packages of plastic explosive. Before the briefing, he slipped away to a bathroom where he used a pair of specially adapted tongs designed to accommodate his 3 remaining fingers to crush the detonator fuse on the first package. He was interrupted before he could arm the second. He entered the briefing room and placed the briefcase under the heavy oak conference table, as close to Hitler as he could manage. Minutes later, he excused himself on the pretense of making a phone call. The bomb detonated at 12:42 p.m. The explosion was violent enough to blow out the windows of the briefing room and send several officers through the walls. 4 people died from their injuries, but Hitler survived, with burst eardrums, a temporarily paralyzed right arm, burns, and wood splinters in both legs, but alive. There were several reasons for this. The most significant was that the briefcase had been moved. After Stauffenberg left the room, another officer, Colonel Heinz Brandt, had found the briefcase in his way and nudged it further under the table and to the other side of a thick oak table support, placing that heavy wooden leg between the bomb and Hitler at the moment of detonation. The support absorbed a significant portion of the blast directed toward Hitler. A second critical factor was the location. The briefing had been moved due to the summer heat from Hitler's usual underground concrete bunker to a wooden surface building above ground. In the enclosed concrete bunker, the blast would almost certainly have been fatal. In the wooden building, much of the force dissipated outward through the walls and windows. Stauffenberg, watching from outside, saw the explosion and concluded that no one inside could have survived. He drove to the airfield, flew to Berlin, and arrived convinced that Hitler was dead, and that the planned coup, Operation Valkyrie, designed to seize control of Germany in the aftermath of Hitler's death, could proceed. But Hitler was not dead, and as the afternoon wore on and it became clear that he had survived, the coup collapsed. Stauffenberg and 3 other central figures of the conspiracy were arrested and executed by firing squad in the courtyard of the Bendler Block military headquarters in Berlin in the early hours of July 21st, just hours after the explosion. Stauffenberg's last words, spoken as the firing squad prepared, expressed his conviction in the cause for which he was dying. In the weeks that followed, the Gestapo conducted one of the most sweeping purges in the history of the regime. Approximately 7,000 people were arrested. Nearly 200 were executed, including Beck, von Treschow, and many others connected to the resistance. Von Treschow, knowing the investigation would reach him, ended his own life at the front on July 21st, rather than face capture and the interrogation that would force him to name others. The failure of July 20th was the last serious military attempt on Hitler's life. The purge that followed effectively destroyed what remained of the organized internal resistance. But by the time it failed, foreign intelligence services had been running their own parallel operations for years. From the earliest years of the Nazi regime, foreign governments had monitored Hitler with varying degrees of urgency and, in some cases, had considered or actively pursued the possibility of removing him. The British Special Operations Executive, the SOE, established in 1940, specifically to conduct sabotage and subversion in occupied Europe, studied the problem of assassinating Hitler with considerable seriousness. Their analysis, however, reached a conclusion that became official British policy and has been debated by historians ever since. Killing Hitler might actually be counterproductive. The argument ran as follows. By 1943 and 1944, Hitler's strategic decision-making had become so erratic, insisting on holding ground, that military logic demanded be abandoned, refusing to permit tactical retreats, making decisions that consistently worsened Germany's position. That some British planners concluded he was more valuable to the Allied cause alive than dead. A competent German general replacing him might have managed the war far more efficiently. This calculation did not mean the British made no attempts. Several operations were considered, and at least 2 reached the planning stage before being abandoned, partly because of the strategic argument, and partly because the practical difficulties were enormous. The Soviet intelligence services took a more direct approach in certain periods, though the full record of Soviet operations remains incompletely declassified. What is known is that Soviet agents made at least one serious attempt to infiltrate the network of individuals surrounding Hitler, and that several operations targeting his logistics and communications were carried out, though these fell short of direct assassination attempts. The most dramatic foreign operation, however, was Operation Long Jump, a reported Soviet and Allied intelligence operation in 1943, timed to the Tehran Conference, where Churchill, Roosevelt, and Stalin were meeting in the Iranian capital. German intelligence had developed a plan, Operation Long Jump, to assassinate all three Allied leaders simultaneously. The Soviets claimed to have uncovered the plot and disrupted it. Whether a parallel effort existed to target Hitler at the same time has been the subject of historical debate, though the evidence for a direct Allied plot against him at Tehran is thin. What is not in doubt is that, by 1944, foreign intelligence services had largely concluded that the most effective internal mechanism for removing Hitler, the German military resistance, was the most promising avenue, and had provided it with material support, including the British-made explosive used in the Smolensk aircraft bomb. The failure of July 20th, 1944, effectively ended that avenue, and as the war moved into its final phase, the attempts became fewer and more desperate, coming now not from organized networks, but from individuals acting in isolation, driven by the knowledge that the war was ending and that Hitler was taking Germany with him. After the July 20th purge, the organized resistance inside Germany had been largely destroyed. The Gestapo's sweep had been thorough enough to reach deep into the military, the civil service, and the intelligence apparatus. Those who had survived, either because they had not yet been identified or because they had been careful enough to leave no traceable connections, operated in conditions of extreme danger. Yet attempts continued. In late 1944, a young infantry officer named Eberhard von Breitenbuch volunteered to carry a pistol into a briefing with Hitler at the Berghof, Hitler's mountain retreat in Bavaria, and shoot him at close range. Von Breitenbuch had been brought to the meeting as an aide to Field Marshal Ernst Busch. He had a pistol concealed in his trouser pocket and was prepared to use it. He was stopped at the door. On that day, for reasons that were never fully explained, Hitler's SS guards had been instructed not to permit aides to enter the briefing room. Only senior officers were allowed through. Von Breitenbuch stood outside while the briefing proceeded, the weapon in his pocket, knowing that the opportunity was gone. He survived the war. He died in 1980. There were other isolated attempts and plans in this period. Individuals who had reached their own breaking point and acted or tried to act without coordination or support. A Wehrmacht soldier named Axel von dem Busche had volunteered earlier, in late 1943, to carry explosives into a military uniform demonstration that Hitler was scheduled to attend, concealing the device on his own body. The demonstration was postponed twice after Allied bombing destroyed the uniforms that were to be displayed, and the opportunity never materialized. Von dem Busche was later severely wounded on the Eastern Front, losing a leg, which ended any further possibility of his involvement. Another officer, Cavalry Captain Georg von Boeselager, developed a plan in 1943 to have a cavalry unit positioned near Hitler's headquarters intercept and attack his convoy. The plan was abandoned after the logistics proved unworkable, and after the events of July 20th destroyed the broader network within which it had been conceived. As 1945 arrived and the military collapse of Germany accelerated on all fronts, the practical conditions for any organized attempt on Hitler's life had effectively ceased to exist. He had retreated into the Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, an underground complex surrounded by the most concentrated security of his entire life, in a city being systematically reduced to rubble by Soviet artillery. The final weeks in the bunker have been documented in extraordinary detail by the accounts of those who were present. By late April 1945, Soviet forces had encircled Berlin. Hitler's decisions, ordering counterattacks by armies that no longer existed, insisting that relief forces were on their way when they were not, had long since departed from any contact with military reality. The men around him were no longer debating whether to act against him. They were simply waiting for the end. On April 29, 1945, Hitler married Eva Braun in the bunker. He dictated his final political testament. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops less than 500 meters from the Chancellery, he ended his own life. Eva Braun died alongside him. He was 56 years old. The 42 documented attempts across more than 2 decades had all failed. A carpenter's bomb had come the closest. The question that historians, ethicists, and ordinary people have debated ever since is deceptively simple. What would have happened if any one of them had succeeded? The honest answer is that no one knows with certainty. History does not offer clean counterfactuals, but the attempts themselves, the people who made them, the reasons they gave, the costs they paid, are part of the historical record of the Second World War in a way that deserves to be understood on its own terms. Georg Elser died in a concentration camp 11 days before Germany surrendered, executed in the closing days of a war that, had his bomb detonated 13 minutes earlier, might never have lasted as long as it did. He received almost no public recognition for decades after the war. A memorial to him now stands near the site of the Burgerbräukeller in Munich. Klaus von Stauffenberg was shot in a courtyard in the early hours of July 21, 1944, having spent his last hours in the belief that the coup had failed because of circumstances beyond his control. He and his co-conspirators are now recognized in Germany as among the most significant figures of the German resistance, people who chose, at the cost of their lives, to act against the regime they had once served. The broader network of the military resistance, Beck, Oster, von Treschow, and hundreds of others, was destroyed in the weeks after July 20th. Most were executed. Some, foreseeing capture, chose their own end rather than face interrogation that would force them to expose those who remained. What all of them shared was a recognition, reached at different times, through different paths, that the course Hitler had set for Germany was not simply a matter of political disagreement. It was a catastrophe that demanded action regardless of personal cost. That recognition drove 42 documented attempts over 2 decades, carried out by men and women of vastly different backgrounds, motivations, and methods. Every single one failed, but the fact that they were made at all, that within Germany, within Hitler's own military, within the circles of people who had initially supported or enabled his rise, there were those who chose resistance, is a part of the history of that era that rarely receives the same attention as the crimes it was trying to prevent. The 42 attempts did not stop the war. They did not prevent the Holocaust, but they form a record of human conscience under the most extreme conditions, and of how close, 13 minutes close, a moved briefcase close, the course of history can come to turning. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.